Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Everything Co-op. This is Vernon Oakes, and this morning my guest is Peter Dean. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Vernon.
And how are you today?
I am very well. Exciting to be on Everything Co-op.
Great to have you. Thank you for taking out of your busy schedule to come and share with us what you've been doing in the co-op world. Well, let's start off by getting people to understand a little bit about who you are. What part of the world are you in now?
I'm in Maryland, suburban Washington, D.C.
Oh, you're a homeboy then. Okay, I'm in D.C. and you in southern Maryland. Okay, you're in the DMV. Where did you grow up and go to school and all of that?
Well, I grew up in the D.C. area. I was actually born in Northern Virginia, grew up in Northwest D.C., and went to junior high and high school in Bethesda.
Okay. And college?
Earlham College in Indiana, Quaker School, which is where I had my first time seriously running a co-op. I helped run the food co-op there.
Wait a minute. You're saying that you were able to learn about co-ops in college and help run a co-op in college?
I did. Actually, I learned about co-ops on an internship in college here in Washington, D.C. with old Greenbelt Consumer Services that had about 20 grocery stores and half a dozen furniture stores around D.C. as cooperatives. And part of that internship, I got to work with Stan Dreyer at NCBA CLUSA and helping him. Truly, it was some filing on the co-op bank bill, but interning on the co-op bank bill for a little bit.
And so the co-op bank bill is National Cooperative Bank. That was
correct.
Back then, they were trying to get that bank up and get it passed through Congress.
That's right. And so I got to meet Stan Dreyer, who became one of my mentors.
So you're unusual. Most people on this show don't learn about co-ops until later on in life, like me. I didn't learn about co-ops until I was 55. I would have loved to have learned about it in college or high school or on the farm, as some have. Okay, so you got to learn about co-ops in college, and you said you were able to work in a food co-op. What did you do early on in that food co-op?
Well, in college, it was a full volunteer co-op, so I was one of the managers, and so we did everything. Everything from bookkeeping to putting the food out, ordering it, staffing the store. We had a lot of volunteers help staff the store, but we did most everything else.
So when you say do you want to learn about running a business, get into a food co-op in college, and you can do everything. Okay.
Yeah.
How did it interfere with your studying? That seemed like it's a big load.
No, actually, one of the things I took a computer programming class, which back then was punch cards, just to show my age. And what I did was designed a little bookkeeping program for the co-op. So I was able to integrate it into my studies. And I was an economics and peace and conflict studies major, so it fit in pretty well.
Peace and conflict. Okay. Economics and peace and conflict, and learning about a food co-op and how to manage it. That's exciting because most people don't have that. So from going to a food co-op in college, and Stan Dreyer, the National Co-op Bank has an award called the Stan Dreyer Spirit of Co-op Award in honor of his name. He did a lot. So, I kind of envy you to be able to work under him and have him as a mentor in this whole co-op world. Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Okay. Where did you go from food co-op in college?
Well, my first job out of college was running a food co-op in Milwaukee. And while I was in Milwaukee, I also helped set up a scattered site housing co-op, which was my first introduction to the housing co-ops. And the crowning thing I did in Milwaukee was we tried to set up a cable television cooperative for the city. Wisconsin is co-op country, so actually the law required a consumer cooperative cable television franchise unless overruled by a supermajority of the council. And unfortunately, Time Warner came in and legally bought the council, and we didn't get it. But it was really exciting to build that coalition, even though we didn't quite get there.
Okay, so you learned a lot, though.
I did.
At a very early age about how it works. Scattered site housing co-op.
Yeah,
how was that, and what role did you play in doing that?
Well, mostly I was an active member. The co-op bought old houses, most sort of Victorian-era houses in the inner city in Milwaukee. Sort of the biggest house in the co-op, which was probably the first house, I believe, was an old leather millionaire's mansion. But the house I lived in was more modest, and all the houses were in lousy shape. But back then, interest rates were through the roof, and there was a federal 3% loan program to repair houses for affordable housing. So we were able to fix up the houses very inexpensively with that. And we probably had, probably 25 or 30 houses, and then ended up, after I had left, they got some small apartment buildings as well. But it was all within walking distance in the same neighborhood.
Okay, so your food co-op, which is a consumer co-op, your housing co-op is consumer co-op, and cable TV is consumer co-op. Okay.
You're seeing a theme.
Where did you go from Milwaukee and all of its excitement?
Well, when we didn't get the cable franchise, I decided to apply to business school and ended up at Duke University as their token liberal. I joke that one of my best friends, Mark, who'd worked on Reagan's campaign, was the next least conservative guy on campus. But it was a really interesting time. I think you have an MBA as well, and co-ops are not necessarily the traditional thing to do with an MBA, but that was what I was looking to do with it.
Come on, hold on, Peter. You said not necessarily. My MBA, there was no conversation about co-ops. I knew nothing about co-ops in the business school. It was all capitalism, all return on investment. Every decision was what gives you the greatest return for the shareholder. Okay, that was all decisions made on that criteria. Nowhere were there co-ops.
Well, I'd go even further and say that really what I was learning at Duke was about monopoly capitalism. It was how do you make a bigger profit than anyone else in the industry can make, and that's certainly not co-ops. It's quite the opposite. But it was still a very good training for my co-op work.
It would have been interesting to have co-op knowledge going into an MBA program where there's no co-ops. Did you get into debates in the classrooms about co-ops? Did you bring that up, or did you kind of keep quiet and go ahead and learn what they were teaching you and then figure out how to apply it to co-op?
Certainly with my friends, I would bring it up, but in class, I mostly stuck to what they were teaching.
Smart. Okay. Very smart. Very smart. And what's amazing to me, which I found out later, I got my MBA from Stanford. And Leland Stanford, who gave the money, the farm, and the money to start a university, also wanted them to teach about worker co-ops. Okay, he was really ahead of his time, but he passed, and Stanford never took up And I've gone back and tried to talk to them about that even as late as 5 years ago, but I can't get any conversations going on about co-ops inside the capitalistic MBA program. Not dogging it, just what it is, monopolistic capital. Okay, sir, so you at Duke after doing a scatter site housing co-op and working on a cable TV co-op and doing a food co-op. Where did you go after Duke?
I went to the Cooperative Housing Foundation, which had developed about 60,000 units of HUD housing co-ops around the country in the 50s and 60s and 70s until Reagan had shut down the HUD co-op programs. And they were trying to figure out how to continue doing something in the U.S. And I helped build a project out in Aurora, Colorado, outside Denver, which was really their last co-op project. It was called Twin Pines Village, which I think ended up later converting to a condo association. But it was still a very interesting time. Wally Campbell, who you may know the name, he was one of the founders of CARE, which people don't know stands for Cooperative American Relief Everywhere. CARE is set up as a cooperative, and he was one of our board members and a wonderful man, really generous with his time. And so we did some interesting work. They were shifting mostly to working on housing cooperatives internationally. So they were doing a big project in Central America. So I worked on financial modeling of a banking system for cooperatives throughout Central America. So that was fascinating.
Was this Cooperative Housing Foundation, was Roger Wilcox associated with that at all?
Yeah, Roger was, and it was interesting. There were folks from all over the co-op world on the board. Credit unions, Nationwide Insurance, the rural electric cooperatives.
And Peter, we talked about your history. It's great. We're going to take our first break, and we're going to come back and take it from Cooperative Housing Foundation to today, what you're doing. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
This is WOL News Talk 1450 AM and 95.9 FM 959.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Everything Co-op. My name is Vernon Oakes, and Mr. Peter Dean is our guest today. He's out of Southern Maryland, grew up here in the D.C. area. And we're going over his history of learning about co-ops in college, then going and getting an MBA where there was little to no discussion about co-ops in the classroom. He talked about it to his friends. And after business school, he went to Cooperative Housing Foundation, and that's what we were talking about. I had mentioned Roger Wilcox because you mentioned Stanley Dreyer as your mentor. Well, Roger was mine. He and Herb Fisher. I joined the National Association of Housing Co-ops, and they were very much involved. And they would almost sit me at their knee to teach me about co-ops, but I was in my 50s already when they were teaching me, not in my 20s or teens as you were when you got started in college. Where did you go from the Cooperative Housing Foundation? Or how long were you with them, and then where did you go after that?
I was with them for about 5 years, and then they were shutting down their domestic work, and I went with Jim Upchurch, one of the vice presidents. Actually, he became the president and did rural affordable housing development. It wasn't cooperatives. It was nonprofit. It was an interfaith group in Western Maryland, and worked with them for several years before I then went and was the Maryland regional manager for Cooperative Services, CSI, the elderly co-op that has about 60 buildings nationally and, 6,000 or 7,000 members, all elderly, it's interesting. It's one co-op nationally. It's a membership co-op, so it's zero equity. and the board of directors is all members elected by the members around those 60 buildings. So it's a really fascinating model, really exciting to work at.
Well, I got to know them at the National Association of Housing Co-ops. CSI was a member, and it was also very interesting that the people at the National that represented CSI were the people that lived in those housing co-ops. And so they're just everyday people making major decisions on how the operating of those different housing co-ops, those different properties. Quite interesting model. I liked it, studying it, went to visit some of them. Okay, so your CSI, which is huge. How long were you with them?
I was with them for several years, and then I got tempted away by one of my best friends who I'd helped him set up a for-profit affordable housing developer in the D.C. area and sort of Silver Spring area. And we ended up buying 3 buildings, about 250 units, and he asked me to run it and made me sort of an offer I couldn't refuse. And I was starting to have small kids, and he said he'd pay me a lot more to work less hard.
Okay.
So I did that for about 20 years, and we sold that business early in the pandemic, having already decided to before the pandemic came along, and thought about what did I want to do next, and thought the thing I'd really always wanted to do was set up a national group just supporting the development of housing co-ops, because I'd written a business plan. Actually, my internship in the middle of business school was with MCBA CLUSA. I was my second time interning with them, and I helped write a business plan for a national group that would help finance co-ops. And it never got off the ground, but I'd always felt like it was something really, really needed, and looked around and found everyone pointed me to I should talk to Andy Riker at UHAB if I was interested in housing co-ops. Small world. One of my wife's best friends from college is Marina Metalios, who's been the training director at UHAB for she's been at UHAB virtually her entire career since college. And so called her up and said, that's the same place, isn't it? And it was, and Andy and I hit it off, and we've been building a national capability, building on UHAB's 50-year history.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I get this straight. In college, 40 years ago, you wrote a business plan. And then you worked your life and you raised your children and all of this, and then you say, I want to implement this business plan. And you looked around and where to do that, and Andy Riker, who's been on the show at UHAB out of New York, they've been in business 50 years or so, creating affordable housing in New York City, which is major. So, and by the way, how many properties or units have they created? What do they?
UHAB has developed over 1,300 affordable housing co-ops and about a bit over 30,000 units, apartments of housing. So the buildings tend to be, 20 or 30 units, 5-story walk-ups, which are typical in New York. So a lot of little co-ops.
But 30,000 families, even if it's a family of 2, that's 60,000 people. If it's a family of 4, then that's 120,000 people. So it's significant, major significance in terms of contribution and impact. Okay, so you're talking to Andy about implementing this college business plan of a national group supporting the development of housing co-ops. And so did you all get this started?
Well, we were talking about it seriously and entered what's a competition for the Morgan Stanley puts on, where they called the Morgan Stanley Challenge, where they give a team of 5 vice presidents to about 10 nonprofits every year. And they gave us about 10 weeks of consulting to figure out what our business model should be, and recommended that we set up incubators around the country and do training for trainers and then follow on consulting. Because one of the things we'd seen with the Cooperative Housing Foundation's work decades ago is a lot of it they sort of come into town, set up a co-op, and leave and go to the next town, and didn't really leave support in place. And with the co-op model, it really works better as a ground up rather than a top down, as you well know. And so our plan is to put on these incubators, which really train local people to develop housing cooperatives, and also still be there to keep supporting the co-ops, because we've seen in New York that's really a key piece. That ongoing support over the decades really, keeps the co-ops healthy and really allows them to flourish.
Well, we also see that in D.C. with TOPA laws that Marion Barry put in place, that those co-ops that were created, converted from apartments to co-ops, too often they didn't have that consistent ongoing training. And 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, they would be in bad shape, maybe physically, the governance, all kinds of different kinds of things, because they didn't keep up with that training. Okay, you have an exciting background to lead to this. What are some of the lessons that you have learned that you're able to put into these incubators? Can you give me one before we take our next break?
Sure. I think one of them is one of the huge benefits is what we call pocket equity. These are limited equity, so they don't get a lot of money when they sell it, but people are able to really have money during their lives as they stay in the co-op. And that's really one of the huge benefits of being a member of a housing co-op, one of these limited equity housing co-ops.
So you call it pocket equity?
Yeah, that it's not the equity you get when you die, when you sell the house. It's money you have all along the way to raise your kids and get an education.
I
think that's a term Andy Riker coined.
I like it a lot. All right, we're going to take our second break, and I would like to come back and talk about some of the other lessons that UHAB has learned in their 50 years of creating affordable housing in New York, and then how you're applying those lessons to these incubators, and were you having incubators? So we have a lot to talk about. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oaks, and the program is Everything Co-op. This program has been sponsored. Well, Peter, this October we'll be on the air for 10 years. And through the 10 years, NCB has been our main sponsor. NCB's mission is to support co-ops and their members by providing innovative financial services. And so, as you're creating housing co-ops, Peter, have you had the opportunity of working with NCB to do any financing, particularly creative financing?
Well, we have not yet done any deals with them, but we are working with them closely. Actually, they've offered me office space. So I'll be working out of their office one day a week coming up. So they're very strong partners of ours. So that will be a lot of fun.
And I expect that, because that's who they've been. They've been our main partner in supporting us, both financially and giving us ideas of people that are doing things in the co-op world. So you hooked up with Andy, and Morgan Stanley did this free consulting for you to hook up incubators. So I said I wanted to come back and talk about other lessons that you have learned in their 50 years of providing affordable housing in New York. What are some of those lessons, and how do you put those into your incubators so that other people can get these same lessons?
Sure. Well, part of it, one of the things we've seen with these 30,000 families, or far more than that, because there's been some turnover, but it's really people are able to build a co-op that builds a community and really helps lift themselves out of poverty, and really gives them a community and just an immense support system beyond the simple savings. Part of it is that by being owners of the co-op, they're permanent members. Even in nonprofit housing, you may not get to stay forever, but as an owner, you follow the rules, pay your rent, or pay your carrying charges. You're going to stay there forever, and it really builds communities that people help each other, they look after each other's kids when they're going to night school. It's just all the things that that it takes to solve your own problems, and people also end up being leaders in their wider community. In New York City, there's a lot of small school boards, and there's a statistically improbable number of co-op leaders who are on their local school boards, for instance. And that's just and people's health improves. Their kids get a better education. Their kids get a better education, and part of that is having the agency, the really solving your own problems is really empowerment. It's one thing to have somebody else help you, but to really help yourself, which is what co-ops are about, really makes all the difference. And that's one of the things we're trying to do nationally is, first of all, with our incubators, empower people locally to develop the housing co-ops with some help from us, but we don't want them to be dependent on us any more than the co-op members should be dependent. That co-ops are about empowerment and really solving our own problems, and that's what we're trying to teach, and what we've learned in those 50 years.
Oh, that's fantastic. And how I found out about co-ops was I was managing housing co-ops in Washington, D.C. And most of those housing co-ops, in the governance, the president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, the board of directors were mainly African-American women in these affordable housing. And I found that most often they didn't, at best they had a high school degree, and they knew how to run a business. They didn't go to get at Duke or Stanford and get an MBA, but they got the training that they need. I call it just-in-time training. They got the training they needed to make very good, informed decisions, and they held each other accountable, and they held me accountable as their manager. They took no mess. And that's what caused me to fall in love with co-ops, was early on watching these ladies in meetings make good decisions and go by the bylaws. And I got, Peter, that this dignity and this improvement and this physical health improvements and mental health improvement was a lot because they got voice. Nowhere else in our society gives African Americans, particularly female African Americans, a voice that where they are heard. In this case, in their community, they're heard, and they would then go get on the board of directors of the school board or run for city council or run for whatever else there might be, or start a food co-op or whatever else they expanded. And one lady, and she turned out to be a German, who had married a man during World War II, an African American, and they raised their 3 children in a co-op, and they all had either law degrees or medical doctor degrees, and she said that was her wealth, was through her children. And you call it pocket wealth. Yes, there's a lot of wealth that these co-ops help to bring. So now you're doing this, taking these lessons that you have learned, that I learned, and different people learn, like the Roger Wilcox of the world, and you're applying these to these incubators. So where are you doing incubators now?
Well, we did one in Rochester recently. We've got some scheduled in Chicago, and Minneapolis we'll be doing this fall, and we're just getting started. So we're talking to folks in LA and Seattle, and I expect in the next year we'll do some incubators there. And then we're also planning to do what we're calling national incubators, which will be open to groups around the country that don't have quite the concentration that something like Chicago does, which they're doing. Really, the city's making a big effort to support co-ops. Not every city is. So we want to be able to train housing professionals around the country and community groups in how to develop housing cooperatives. And some of the people already know something about affordable housing development or something about co-ops. It's one group in Nashville. It's a worker co-op center. They know co-ops, but they don't know housing. So we try to train people sort of soup to nuts, everything you need to do to develop a housing cooperative, and how to structure it so that it can remain permanently affordable. And that's one of the things that we've seen around the country is about half of the limited equity co-ops that have been developed in the last 70 years are no longer affordable because of the way they were structured, which is a real shame. And so we're trying to teach people, to do them in a way that is truly sustainable.
So we found the same thing here. I was on a task force that looked at the affordable housing co-ops, and like right now there are 99, and I don't know I think the number sounds like there were 200s created, some much larger number created. And I had managed a couple of them that the then board decided to sell them, either to make them into a condo and sell them, or just sell them outright for somebody else to come in, and then they captured that money because of gentrification. And I didn't think they had it until you start reading their deeds and their loan documents. More often than not, it was affordable as long as they had a loan. That loan was 40 years. So after 40 years, they could do whatever they wanted. Some decided to continue to make it affordable, and some decided to take the money and run. So,
right. Now, when we did a national survey of the about 150,000 HUD-insured co-op units, only 35,000 remain limited equity because you're exactly right. They were tied, the restrictions were tied to the mortgage, and 40 years might seem like a long time when you're starting out, but you and I have both been around long enough to know 40 years comes and goes, and you still need affordable housing. And one of the things that we're now encouraging is having community land trusts own the land under cooperatives. And that provides a way for the community to keep the affordability and take that choice away from the future resident, and able to keep it affordable while still having community input into how it's managed in the long run.
So what's a community land trust?
9-year lease on the land.
But Peter, what's a community land trust?
Community land trust is an organization that has typically three kinds of board members: residents who live in buildings that are on their land, other community members, typically low-income people who just live in the neighborhood, and the third group is professionals who are supportive, perhaps lawyers or accountants who can give the board expertise that is helpful to running the corporation in the long run.
But then
I'm also on the board of Grounded Solutions, which is the National Community Land Trust Association.
But the community land trust owns the land.
They own the land, and the co-op owns the building. And one thing that people often don't realize is when there's massive appreciation through gentrification, often it's the land that's appreciating, and the building itself is actually depreciating. It's wearing out. And so the real value long-term is the land. And, if we can preserve that for community's benefit, you don't end up with the co-ops getting sold off and what I call a last man club. It's whoever happens to be there benefits, not the people who've built that co-op over the decade.
So, Peter, we are going to go into our last break. I'm really excited about your history of all that you have done in the co-op world, and I'm very much interested in what you're going to do. So I'd like to come back and talk a little bit more about your incubators, like particularly what's going on in Chicago, or what did you all do in Rochester, New York? But it looks like you're all over the nation. So what you're doing, and I'm most interested, Peter, and I assume you and Andy Riker have talked about this. What does the future look like? And how we can keep these affordable housing co-ops going. We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial.
News Talk 1450 WOL-AM, where information is power.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Everything Co-op, and we have Mr. Peter Dean on with us today. And we were talking about incubators. And they are all over the U.S., in Chicago and Rochester, Nashville, Seattle, L.A. in the future. So what do you do in the incubators? What kinds of training do you want to impart on people?
Well, we start out, of course, with introducing what is a limited equity co-op and how does it differ from either a nonprofit owner or traditional home ownership with single family or condo, and then we go through what's involved with developing it in both financing and land acquisition or building acquisition. Is of course different if it's an occupied building that is converting to a co-op than if you're doing new construction, but we cover both kinds of co-op development. And a big piece, of course, is how do you make it affordable, which is harder and harder with little federal money and interest rates rising. But we are seeing cities around the country and states putting serious money into affordable housing, which is part of why the choice of where people are calling us to help is places that do have opportunities for the money. But we also go over the training necessary for the members and structuring the co-op so that it can continue to afford training over the long run. That's one of the mistakes that was made in the past, was not building any money into the operating budget in the long run to pay for that support. And
UHAB put that into their budgets, didn't they?
They did.
UHAB with the units in New York.
Into the underwriting of the building. It's not a huge amount of money, but as you know, even $10,000 a year is a lot of money when you're talking affordable housing.
Yes, and too often that's the first thing that goes out of the budget when there's crises or issues. Is if it's in the budget of the building, it just goes away. Yeah.
And some of it's interesting things like management versus governance. As you know, as a building manager, that's very different than the governance of the co-op, and you want to make sure both that they both get done, but that they also both are really nurtured. And management is sort of the day-to-day work on the co-op, and the governance is setting the rules and policies for the managers to implement. And so it's really trying to help people, different groups really be able to develop affordable housing co-ops that are sustainable. And so it's very exciting, rewarding work, getting to work with a lot of really amazing people around the country. You mentioned Chicago, and they have an initiative to build a cooperative infrastructure that will support housing co-ops, but also worker co-ops, community land trusts, and a notion I'm not terribly familiar with of it's commercial cooperatives. It seems like shopping centers or the like that are owned by the community that can be used as a community resource. And so that's one of the fourth piece they're trying to support. I believe there's a group in Chicago that's been working on that I have not gotten very familiar with yet. But Chicago, like D.C., has a long co-op history and quite a few housing co-ops, though a lot of them, like the ones you were mentioning in D.C., have been lost to affordability. It was a large black co-op, I believe several hundred units, that the board sold it to a developer last year. It's just a real shame. And that's not the preservation of those existing co-ops that other groups are working on in Chicago. We're not working as much on that, although we do work with NAHC on the Development Preservation Committee to support preservation of co-ops around the country. So that's really separate from our incubators.
And so in Chicago, one of the reasons that they seem like they would be a good partner is the city has put up money to create this co-op system, this ecosystem of co-ops. And I can't remember how much. It was a huge amount of money that they put up.
They've put about $2 million into sort of creating the infrastructure, another $2 million into pre-development grants for different co-ops, and are talking about something in the neighborhood of $20 million overall to support the actual development of the co-ops. So, that's a really great start. Los Angeles is a real model in terms of financing. They passed what they're calling the mansion tax, which will raise probably $500 million a year for the city of Los Angeles for affordable housing. And $100 million of that is earmarked for co-ops and community land trusts. So that's why.
You're saying that mansion tax will create $500 million a year, and $100 million will go into affordable co-ops.
Correct. It's really, that's now you're talking real money.
Now you can do something. Yeah.
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 So that's why we're working with the groups there.
What about up in Seattle? You got you're hitting the middle of the country, and you got LA, the southern part now. You talked about Seattle, Nashville. You talked about Rochester, New York earlier.
Yep. Now we're working with groups, as you say, all over the country. Frequently, where there's groups see an opportunity to get financing, which as I mentioned earlier is the hardest part with any kind of affordable housing these days, and co-ops, if anything, are harder to finance. The biggest way of financing affordable housing in the U.S. is what are called low-income housing tax credits, which are very difficult for co-ops to use because they involve the building being owned by investors for the first 15 years. So, it's been a difficult, model to try to use them, and when that's the biggest source of federal money. But state and city monies have been important in New York, and other cities and states are modeling after that and creating pools of money that are available, and that's which is really heartening.
So I didn't know it was under Reagan's administration that stopped the federal funding for low-income co-ops, housing co-ops, but they replaced that funding with low-income housing tax credit. And these tax credits, to me, are just giving rich people the ability to make more money. And I find that very, very interesting that policies are created to help rich people get more money, where when you are able to create housing co-ops, for all of the reasons that you talked about and Andy and you have found out about, it really helps people that are in poverty or poor get dignity and get pocket wealth and get children to go to colleges and all of those different kinds of things. And so how do we get the federal government, how do we get people in Congress and in the Senate that will put money in so that everyday people get the money, not rich people making more and more money? To me, that's what the focus ought to be. At least that's my focus. How do we do that?
Well, one idea that we've been looking at is in the IRA, the climate bill, the farm co-ops, the electric co-ops were able to get a provision for direct pay energy tax credit. So they always had to do the same thing, get an investor to own the solar farm or wind farm in order to get the tax credits. And now they've got a provision that allows them to just go to the Treasury and file a tax return and get a direct refund of those credits. If we could do that for housing, it would make it much more straightforward to develop a housing co-op.
That would be awesome.
That would really be the most straightforward way to modify the existing program to work for co-ops.
Peter, we only have 1 minute. You have 30 seconds of something you'd like to leave people with?
Well, I guess that it is the people can solve their own problems if we give them the right kind of help. And that's training and government support. And the rich people get lots of support of housing. If we took a little bit of the government support of dollars for housing to go to wealthy people to poor people, we'd have a lot better situation.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for taking our time and sharing. Everybody out there, we will see you next Thursday. Please live cooperatively.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.